A pregnant woman stopped for a routine traffic violation, but within moments, she was lying on the ground in agony, kicked by the very officer meant to protect her. The unimaginable just happened, and you won't believe what happens next. Her name is Maya. 8 months pregnant, just trying to make it through another day. She had no idea that a routine traffic stop would turn into a nightmare that would change her life forever. The officer? Jake Matthews, a man with power, but also with a dangerous edge to him. Maya's first warning should have been the cold look in his eyes when he approached her car. Today, you're going to witness how everything spiraled out of control in the blink of an eye. If you want more gripping stories like this, hit subscribe and stay with us till the end to uncover the shocking truth. Maya hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She hadn't done anything wrong. Why was he asking her to step out? A chill ran down her spine, but she complied, slowly opening the car door and stepping onto the gravel shoulder. The sun beat down on her, but it did little to melt the ice in her veins. "Is there a problem, officer?" Maya asked, her voice shaky but calm. She tried to keep her cool, to not let the fear creeping into her chest show. Officer Matthews didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked her up and down, his gaze lingering just a little too long on her swollen belly. A flicker of something dark crossed his eyes, something Maya didn't understand, but it made her uneasy. I need you to place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." Her heart was pounding now. "What's going on? I haven't done anything wrong." "Hands on the hood." The tone of his voice sent alarm bells ringing in her head, but she had no choice. She turned and placed her palms on the scalding hot hood of the car. Maya's body trembled as she lay on the rough asphalt, clutching her stomach with trembling hands. Her mind raced through 1,000 frantic thoughts. Her baby, her life, her future, spinning like a carousel of horror she couldn't stop. The world around her blurred as the reality of what just happened began to sink in. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not now. Not when she was so close to meeting her child. As her eyes fluttered open and shut, she caught a glimpse of Officer Matthews standing above her. His face was twisted in a mix of anger and indifference, and he was yelling, but the words barely registered. Something about resisting, about cooperating. But she hadn't resisted. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her lips moved, but her voice was a mere whisper, lost in the air. "Help me, please," she begged, her words fragile, as if they could break apart in the wind. But Matthews wasn't listening. His eyes, cold and unfeeling, were focused somewhere beyond her, as if she were no more than an inconvenience to his day. Maya could feel something wasn't right inside her. A sharp, intense pain throbbed through her abdomen, and panic gripped her. Her baby. She couldn't shake the thought. Was the baby hurt? Every instinct she had screamed to protect her unborn child, but she was powerless, lying there, helpless on the ground. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the fear settled deep in her bones. The sky above her seemed too bright, too blue, a cruel contrast to the nightmare she was living. She tried to move, to get up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Every muscle screamed in protest, and her vision was swimming with tears. Then, faintly, through the haze of pain and fear, she heard something, a voice, but not Matthews. A woman's voice, far off but getting closer. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop." Maya's heart leapt with the faintest flicker of hope. Someone had seen. Someone was coming to help. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and Maya clung to it like a lifeline. "Stop. She's pregnant," the woman screamed again, her footsteps pounding toward them. Maya could hear the scuffle of feet, the sound of a phone dialing, the promise of justice crackling through the air. Officer Matthews hesitated for a split second, his steely gaze shifting toward the approaching woman. But Maya knew, it wasn't. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to sit up, her body still aching from the brutal assault. But the presence of the other officers, especially the rookie, gave her a flicker of hope she hadn't felt before. She could see it in their faces. They knew. And the weight of that realization began to shift the balance of power. Officer Matthews' face twisted in anger, but there was no hiding the panic creeping into his eyes. His fingers twitched nervously at his sides, and his booming bravado began to crack. I didn't do anything wrong. She resisted. I was just. Enough. The supervisor's voice cut through the chaos like a gavel slamming down. He turned to Matthews, his expression cold and unyielding. We saw the footage. You're done. Matthews opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. His once confident demeanor crumbled like a house of cards, leaving nothing but a broken man desperate to escape the consequences of his actions. The other officers stepped forward, placing him in handcuffs, and for the first time, Maya saw the reality of his situation sink in. He wasn't above the law, after all. The rookie officer, his face pale but determined, knelt beside Maya, offering her a hand. Are you okay, We've got paramedics on the way. Tears welled in Maya's eyes as she nodded, clutching her belly protectively. I don't know. My baby. Her voice cracked as the weight of everything finally hit her. What if something had happened to her child? What if it was too late? The sound of the ambulance's siren grew louder, and within moments, paramedics were at her side, carefully lifting her onto a stretcher. The pain in her stomach throbbed, but the panic in her mind was worse. She needed to know her baby was okay. That was all that mattered now. As they loaded her into the ambulance, she caught one last glimpse of Officer Matthews being led away in cuffs, his head hanging low. His career was over. His life, as he knew it, was over. And for the first time, Maya felt a sliver of justice, though it was far from enough to erase the trauma he had caused. Inside the ambulance, the paramedic smiled gently at her. We'll take care of you, and we'll check on the baby, okay? Just stay with me. Maya closed her eyes, gripping the edge of the stretcher. The sound of her own heartbeat was loud in her ears, but it was nothing compared to the desperate hope she held inside, that her baby would survive this. The rookie officer stood at the edge of the road, watching the ambulance speed away. His body camera still recorded, but now it captured the aftermath, the weight of justice in action. He had made a choice. He had chosen not to look away, and because of that, the truth had come to light. There was a heavy lesson in it, one he would carry with him for the rest of his career. And for Officer Matthews, that moment of fear was just the beginning. Maya's heart was in overdrive, thudding so hard she thought Officer Jake could probably hear it too. She tried to control her breath, to keep her voice steady, but the growing weight of the moment was making it harder to keep it together. She'd seen this kind of thing unfold before, enough viral videos to know when things were about to go south. This didn't feel like a typical traffic stop. It felt like a storm brewing, and she was standing right in the middle of it. She did what she thought was best, what she had to do. Comply. Keep her cool. But everything in her body was screaming. She didn't want to get out of the car, didn't want to make a wrong move. Yet, there she was, pushing the door open as slowly as she could, hoping that her every motion screamed, I'm not a threat. She stepped out, trying not to notice how the world around her seemed to slow down. Everything was still, too quiet. Then her gaze fell on Jake's hand resting just above his gun holster. Why was it there? Why wasn't he saying anything? Maya's pulse quickened again, and a wave of nausea hit her. But this wasn't just fear for herself. It was fear for something much more precious. The child inside her. The thought made her hand instinctively move to her belly, as if she could then, without warning, Jake's hand shot out like a viper, clamping onto her arm with a grip that sent a jolt of pain racing through her body. It was so sudden, so harsh, that a cry escaped her lips before she could stop it. His hand felt like a vice, squeezing too tightly, and all she could think was that he didn't care. He didn't care that she was hurting, that she was pregnant. She wasn't a person to him, just something to control, something to overpower. Her stomach churned, not just from the pressure of his hold, but from the terror gripping her insides. He was pulling her now, dragging her from the car with an aggression that felt entirely unnecessary, as if she had committed some unspeakable crime. But what had she done wrong? She was just trying to make it home safely, to live another day. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a reason, any reason, why this was happening. And nothing made sense. Please, she managed, her voice weak and shaking. I'm pregnant. She didn't know if he heard her. She didn't know if he cared. The words hung in the air, desperate, pleading, but they seemed to fall on deaf ears. Jake's face remained a mask of indifference, his grip unyielding, his movements mechanical, almost robotic. There was no flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, nothing to suggest he even registered what she'd said. The panic inside her was suffocating now, clawing at her throat, making it hard to breathe. Her body struggled to keep up with his pace as he yanked her along, her feet stumbling over the uneven ground. It felt like a nightmare, one where you're running, but you can't move fast enough, and the danger is closing in no matter what you do. Then, in an instant, the nightmare turned into something far worse. The world around her seemed to freeze, the air thick with dread, and then everything sped up. Time itself seemed to snap like a rubber band stretched too far. Jake's boot moved, a blur of motion that her mind couldn't fully process until it was too late. The blow landed on her. Time had become a twisted, cruel thing, stretching endlessly as Maya lay there on the cold ground, clutching her stomach. The world around her faded. Sounds, colors, everything was smeared into a haze of confusion. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her anymore, couldn't feel anything but the searing, unbearable pain radiating from her core. She gasped, but no breath seemed to fill her lungs, no air seemed to reach her, like the world had collapsed in on her, suffocating her in the worst way imaginable. Her mind was racing, but all her thoughts were fragmented, scattered. Was this real? Could this possibly be happening? The thought of her baby, the life growing inside her, was a scream in her head now, echoing louder and louder. Was her baby okay? Her hands pressed harder against her belly, almost as if her touch could somehow undo the damage, as if sheer will could shield her unborn child from the violence that had just ripped through her world. Nothing else mattered anymore. Jake's figure loomed above her, but his voice was distant, warped. Whatever he was shouting didn't matter. His presence had become a blurry shadow at the edges of her consciousness, unimportant in the face of her panic. The only sound she could truly hear was the frantic drumbeat of her heart, thudding in her ears, a reminder that time hadn't truly stopped, no matter how much she wished it would. She could feel the tears building, burning in her eyes, but they wouldn't fall. Everything inside her was screaming, but no sound came out. She was frozen in place, locked in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Help! The word was stuck in her throat, lodged there by the fear that was clawing at her insides. And still, the terror kept growing, wrapping itself around her like chains. Maya's world spun wildly, the pain crashing through her like relentless waves, pulling her under with each agonizing breath. Her body, battered and bruised, screamed for relief, but somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear, beneath the agony, there was something stronger, the instinct to survive. The need to protect her baby. That primal force pushed her beyond the physical torment, urged her to fight through the fog of pain and terror that threatened to consume her. Her fingers trembled violently, slick with sweat and shaky from adrenaline as they fumbled for her phone. It felt impossibly heavy, like her own hands were betraying her, refusing to obey as her vision blurred, her head swimming in a thick haze of panic and exhaustion. She could barely make out the numbers on the screen, each one a blurry smudge, but somehow, she managed to dial 911. The phone felt like a lifeline in her grasp, though the weight of it felt overwhelming, her mind screaming that she wasn't fast enough. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each one a battle against the crushing pain radiating through her abdomen. Her lungs felt tight, like the air was being stolen from her by some unseen force. And yet, she found her voice, weak though it was, a whisper laced with desperation, barely audible through her choked sobs. Help, she whispered, the word escaping her like a fragile prayer. Please, help me. It was hardly more than a whimper, her voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. But on the other end of the line, it was enough. The calm, steady voice of the dispatcher cut through the chaos, assuring her that help was on the way. It felt like the first thread of hope amidst the swirling storm, but it wasn't enough to calm her racing heart. Relief mixed with terror in her chest. The sirens, distant at first, became her only focus. Faint wails echoing through the night, growing louder with each passing second. They were coming for her. Help was coming. She wasn't alone anymore, but she couldn't let herself believe it just yet. Not while he was still there. Jake. His shadow loomed over her, his presence suffocating, as though the very air around him was tainted. His boots thudded against the pavement as he took a step toward her, and though she couldn't see his face, she could feel his arrogance, the cruel confidence that radiated off him like heat from a fire. He wasn't done. Not yet. As the sirens grew louder, flashing red and blue lights began to dance through the darkness, casting the scene in a surreal, almost nightmarish glow. The police cars screeched to a halt, the officers spilling out like reinforcements in a war zone, their badges gleaming under the harsh lights. It was the cavalry. They were here, but Jake didn't waver. He didn't flinch. If anything, his arrogance only grew. She was resisting arrest, Jake barked, his voice booming with authority as he stood tall before his colleagues, spinning his lie with ease. She's dangerous. You don't know what she did. His words were cold and calculated, spoken with the same ease that he had used to kick her. Maya lay on the ground, her hand clutching her belly protectively as if shielding her unborn child from the world's cruelty. She was trembling, her body racked with pain, her mind teetering on the edge of unconsciousness. But she heard him. She heard every lie he spat, twisting reality into something grotesque and unrecognizable. How could he? How could he stand there and turn this around on her as if she was the criminal? As if she had done something to deserve this? Her mind reeled, disbelief clashing with rage inside her as her vision blurred, the edges of the world fading in and out of focus. But even in her weakened state, even with her body screaming for her to surrender, her spirit refused to break. Jake's words felt like venom, infecting everything they touched. The truth was twisted, distorted by his cold indifference. He had no remorse, no guilt for what he had done. In his eyes, he was untouchable, invincible under the shield of his badge. His gaze was hard, his jaw clenched, daring anyone to challenge him. But Maya knew better. She knew the truth, and no matter how much pain she was in, no matter how close she was to losing consciousness, she wouldn't let him win. She wouldn't let him rewrite what had happened. Not here. Not in front of the very people who were supposed to protect her. Through blurry eyes, Maya forced herself to focus. The sirens, the flashing lights, the murmurs of the officers, everything felt distant, like it was happening in slow motion. But her resolve was sharper than ever. She wasn't going to let Jake get away with it. Not this time. Maya's grip tightened on her stomach, her fingers digging into her skin as if holding on to the last shred of strength she had left. Her body trembled, but her spirit was unshakable. Through the haze of pain, through the fog of fear, she clung to one thing, the truth. And she wasn't going to let it be buried. Not by Jake. Not by anyone. As the other officers surveyed the scene, a palpable tension settled over them. Most exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain how to respond to Jake's commands. After all, he was a senior officer, one of their own. And in a profession built on loyalty and hierarchy, questioning someone like Jake wasn't something you did lightly. The weight of their silence was suffocating, as though every breath they took only deepened their complicity. But then, something changed. A shift in the air, subtle at first, like the quiet before a storm. One officer, a young, nervous rookie, the kind whose hands still smelled of fresh academy textbooks and whose badge gleamed as though it had never seen a speck of dust, stepped forward. His uniform was impeccable, almost too crisp, like someone trying hard to live up to the ideals stitched into the fabric. You could tell he hadn't been in the field long, and yet, that idealism in his eyes hadn't been crushed by the weight of the real world. Not yet. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his hands trembling as they hovered over his body camera. This rookie had seen everything, every brutal detail that had unfolded before him. From the moment Jake had ripped Maya out of the car like she was nothing, to the vicious kick that connected with her pregnant belly. He had watched it all, his stomach lurching with each act of cruelty, disgust building in his throat like bile. It was wrong. Every fiber of his being screamed it. He hadn't signed up for this. He had joined the force to protect people, not to stand idly by while someone wielded their authority like a weapon. His heart raced, each thud echoing in his ears like a countdown. Could he really do this? Challenge a senior officer? His colleagues? His career? His eyes darted to the other officers. They stood frozen, locked in their uncertainty, eyes downcast, shoulders stiff. No one else was stepping up. No one else was ready to speak the truth. The unspoken rule was clear: you don't cross the line. But his conscience was screaming at him to act, to do what was right, not what was easy. He swallowed hard. Maybe he was new. Maybe he was scared. But he couldn't stay silent. Not this time. Taking a shaky breath, the rookie officer squared his shoulders and stepped forward. His legs felt like lead, and yet he forced them to move, one step at a time. His fingers, still trembling, unclipped the body camera from his vest. His hand hovered in the air for a moment, wavering as doubt tried to paralyze him again. But then, with a determined resolve, he approached the scene supervisor, who had just arrived on site. The rookie's voice was barely audible, but each word came out with the weight of everything he had witnessed. "You need to see this," he murmured, his eyes pleading as he handed over the camera. The supervisor, a grizzled veteran with years of experience etched into the lines of his face, raised an eyebrow. His initial expression was one of mild irritation. What could be so urgent that this rookie was shaking in his boots? But as he took the camera and began to watch the footage, that irritation faded quickly. His face tightened, the color draining from his skin as the brutal reality of what had transpired played out in front of him. The kick. The raw, brutal force of it. The way Maya's body had crumpled to the ground, clutching her stomach in agony. The sheer terror in her eyes as Jake loomed over her, unrelenting. The silence around them grew heavier with each passing second, thick like suffocating fog. No one moved. No one breathed. The truth was laid bare, impossible to deny. The supervisor's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as the video finished. He was no stranger to tough calls. But this was different. He glanced at Jake, who still stood tall, defiant, like he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in Jake's eyes. He knew. And now, so did everyone else. With a grim nod, the supervisor handed the camera back to the rookie, his voice low but firm. "Get internal affairs on the line. Now." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But that one sentence hit like a hammer. The shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The truth couldn't be buried anymore. Not under lies, not under rank, not under the badge. The rookie officer stood there, his heart still pounding, but a small wave of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had chosen justice, even when it was the hardest thing in the world. And now, finally, there was hope for accountability. But for Maya, lying on the ground, clutching her belly, the battle was far from over. As the video played on, Jake's arrogance began to crumble, piece by piece, like a sandcastle caught in an incoming tide. He shifted uneasily, his once confident stance betraying cracks that widened with each second. His eyes flicked nervously around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The damning footage on the body camera was like a slow-motion train wreck, inescapable and undeniable. The smug facade that had shielded him began to fracture under the weight of the truth now exposed for all to see. The other officers, who moments ago had hesitated out of loyalty or fear, now turned to him with suspicion. Their expressions hardened, trust evaporating like mist under the searing light of what had really happened. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in real time. Jake, the senior officer, the man they had once followed without question, was now a sinking ship. And no one was rushing to save him. Maya, still lying on the ground, was slowly regaining her strength, though pain still coursed through her body. The ache was ever present, but something more powerful than pain was rising within her: determination. Her vision was blurred, but she could see enough. She could feel the shift in the air, the crack in Jake's armor. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Not after everything he had put her through. The fire inside her, the one she thought had been extinguished by the brutality of Jake's attack, now reignited with fierce intensity. This man had tried to break her, had tried to take everything from her, but she was not broken. And she wasn't going to let him get away with what he had done. Not to her, not to her unborn child. With great effort, Maya pushed herself up slightly. Her body trembled under the strain, her limbs heavy, her muscles screaming in protest. But her spirit? Her spirit was unyielding. Her hands clutched her belly protectively, as though shielding the life inside her with the force of her will alone. And then, despite the pain, despite everything, she found her voice. You thought I wouldn't find out. Maya's voice, though weak, cut through the tense air like a razor, sharp and unrelenting. You thought you could get away with this. The words, though softly spoken, carried the weight of an avalanche. They hung in the air like a challenge, exposing Jake for the coward he truly was. Her voice trembled slightly, but the resolve behind it was unmistakable. This was no longer just about her survival, it was about justice. The officers surrounding them remained silent, their eyes darting between Jake and Maya. But the shift was undeniable. The power dynamic, once so firmly in Jake's hands, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. He could feel it, too. His face twisted, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. His bravado, his authority, all of it evaporated in the face of what he could no longer control. What he couldn't explain away or manipulate. Fear crept into his eyes, real, unfiltered panic. He had lost control, and now the truth, which he had so carefully buried under lies and authority, was unraveling in front of him. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The rookie officer stood a few steps back, watching this scene unfold like a slow, inevitable reckoning. He had done the right thing, even though the consequences for him might still be uncertain. But as he stood there, watching Maya rise, watching Jake's facade crumble, he knew that this was only the beginning. There was a long road ahead, but justice was starting to uncoil, like a snake ready to strike. And Maya? She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a fighter, and with every breath, she was reclaiming her power, her story. She wasn't going to let Jake's lies define her. This was her moment, and Jake was going to face the consequences for what he had done. As her words echoed in the air, they didn't just mark the end of Jake's control. They marked the beginning of a reckoning, one that would ripple far beyond this moment. The aftermath was swift and decisive, like a storm that finally cleared the air after wreaking havoc. Jake Matthews, once a symbol of authority and power, found himself drowning in the consequences of his actions. For years, he had walked through life with the weight of a badge and gun, wielding them with arrogance, as though he was untouchable. But that facade shattered the moment the footage surfaced. His suspension came faster than he could blink, a swift kick to the ego that had long swelled beyond control. The evidence was clear. The body cam footage, the very tool meant to protect officers like him, was now the sword poised to cut down his career. It didn't lie, didn't miss a beat. Every second of it showed the truth, unraveling any defense he could possibly summon. The air that had once buzzed with his bravado now hung heavy with the undeniable proof of his brutality. But the reckoning didn't stop there. What began as a suspension turned into something far more damning. The footage sparked outrage, spreading like wildfire. People took to the streets, their chants echoing a fury that could no longer be silenced. Social media exploded, amplifying the story far beyond the borders of the city. The headlines were relentless. Officer assaults pregnant woman. Caught on camera. Police brutality at its worst. This wasn't just another scandal. This was a flashpoint. Jake was arrested, his face plastered across every news channel. The caption beneath his mugshot reading, charged with excessive force and assault. His name, once spoken with respect among his fellow officers, was now sullied, the very embodiment of the system's darkest flaws. His descent from power was rapid and unrelenting, like a free fall with no end in sight. The media circled like vultures, dissecting every detail of his life, his career, and, most damning of all, his actions that day. The city's police department, eager to distance itself from the scandal, launched a full-scale investigation. His fellow officers, who once turned a blind eye to his behavior, now avoided his name like a curse. No one was willing to go down with him. He was left to bear the weight of his crimes alone. His life, which had been built on the authority of a uniform, was now crumbling at its foundation. The arrogance that once shielded him from consequence had vanished, leaving only the cold reality of his fall. Jake Matthews had once believed he was above the law, a belief that cost him everything: his career, his reputation, and his freedom. And in the quiet moments, as the noise of the world raged on outside, he had nothing left but the harsh realization that the system he had so often relied upon had turned its back on him. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. He was no longer Officer Jake Matthews, protector of the law. He was simply a man stripped of his power, facing the full force of justice. For Maya, the road to justice was long and grueling, paved with sleepless nights and courtroom stares that weighed heavy on her soul. Each day in court felt like stepping back into that dark moment, the one she tried so hard to leave behind but could never quite escape. It was as if time itself had slowed, forcing her to endure every painful detail of that day on repeat, over and over again. The legal process dragged on, with motions and objections stretching what felt like an eternity. But despite the emotional toll, she knew this fight wasn't just for her anymore. It was for the life growing inside her, the child who had survived the unthinkable, whose heart kept beating when everything else seemed to stop. Every tear she shed, every sigh she held back, was for them. Sitting in the courtroom, hearing the cold recounting of the assault, the clinical descriptions from lawyers trying to capture the raw brutality of what had happened, there were moments when she felt like it was too much. Like the walls were closing in, and the weight of it all might crush her. But every time she thought about giving in, she felt a flutter inside her, a reminder of why she couldn't afford to stop. That tiny heartbeat was her anchor, her reason to keep standing, keep pushing. She wasn't just fighting for her justice, she was fighting for a future that her child deserved. A future free from the shadows of that day. And Maya wasn't alone. Far from it. What started as a solitary battle soon became a rallying cry. People began to show up: women's rights groups, mothers, survivors of police brutality, everyday citizens who had heard her story and saw in her fight something deeply personal. Her pain resonated far beyond the courtroom, rippling out into communities who had been voiceless for too long. Activists showed up with signs and megaphones, demanding accountability, not just for Maya but for everyone who had ever been hurt by the abuse of power. The support was overwhelming at times. Letters, phone calls, offers of help. Maya had become more than just a victim. She had become a symbol, a beacon of resilience, and a voice for the countless others who had been silenced before her. Each day she walked into that courtroom, Maya carried the weight of not only her story but the stories of so many others. The faces she saw in the gallery, those who had experienced their own versions of injustice, were her strength. They reminded her that this fight was bigger than one moment of violence. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what she did, that no other mother would have to worry about her unborn child being harmed by those sworn to protect. Through it all, Maya remained steadfast. She held her head high, her spine straight, and her resolve unshaken. Even on the hardest days, when it felt like the system was dragging its feet, delaying justice at every turn, she didn't waver. She was there to see it through, to ensure that the truth was told, no matter how painful it was to relive. Her strength wasn't just in surviving that horrible day, it was in refusing to let it define her or her child's future. After months of excruciating legal battles, testimonies, and gut-wrenching delays, the moment of reckoning finally came. Jake Matthews, the man who had once towered over her with the unchecked authority of a badge, was sentenced to prison. The gavel struck like a final blow, echoing through the courtroom as his fate was sealed. The arrogant officer who had once believed he was above the law was now nothing more than a convicted criminal. His career, his reputation, everything he had once built his life upon, crumbled into dust. No longer would he be remembered as a protector of the law. His name would forever be associated with shame, corruption, and the violent abuse of power. For Maya, the victory was bittersweet. Justice had been served, yes, but it couldn't erase the trauma of what had happened. It couldn't turn back time and undo the damage. But what it did do was send a message, one that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. The system had spoken, and it had sided with her, with the truth. Jake Matthews had been held accountable, and in that, there was a small but significant victory for all who had fought beside her. Maya's fight wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. And with each step she took out of that courtroom, head held high, she knew that she had done more than just win a legal battle. She had lit a fire, one that would continue to burn long after the headlines faded. Though the legal battle had been won, Maya's journey was far from over. Healing isn't something that can be marked by a court ruling. It doesn't come with a deadline or a finish line. The physical wounds, the bruises and aches that had once served as reminders of that horrific day, had mostly healed. But the emotional scars, the ones etched deep into her soul, were a different story. Those would take time, patience, and a strength that Maya was just beginning to rediscover within herself. Every morning was a reminder of what she had survived. The nightmares still crept in sometimes, vivid and unforgiving, making her relive the worst moments. But each time she woke up, gasping for breath, her hand instinctively went to her belly, a belly that had once shielded a tiny life during the chaos. Her baby, the miracle that had survived alongside her, was a constant reminder that amidst the horror, there had been a glimmer of hope. That glimmer was now the heartbeat of her new life. Every day was a new challenge, but Maya found strength she never knew she had. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged. She was a mother. And with that came a new fire, a new purpose that burned brighter than anything she had ever felt before. She wasn't simply healing from the trauma. She was rebuilding her life from the ground up, stronger than ever. Every time she held her child, she felt that strength coursing through her, an unbreakable bond that fueled her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where her child wouldn't have to grow up in a world where justice was elusive, where those in power could trample over the innocent without consequence. Maya's case had done more than just deliver personal justice. It had set a precedent. It had become a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar injustices, but who had never been given the chance to speak out. Her voice, once trembling with fear and uncertainty, now carried the weight of her experience, of her victory, of her survival. She had stood up against a system designed to silence people like her, and she had not only been heard, she had been believed. Activists, community leaders, and survivors reached out to her, sharing stories of their own battles, their own fears, and their hopes for a better future. Maya had become a symbol, not just of survival but of triumph in the face of insurmountable odds. And while the weight of that responsibility sometimes felt overwhelming, she knew she had a role to play. Her fight wasn't just her own anymore. It was for all the others still trapped in the silence she had once known too well. Justice, she realized, doesn't come easy. It isn't something handed out in neat packages or tied up with a bow. It requires courage, persistence, and an unwavering belief that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually prevail. And for Maya, that belief had been tested in every possible way. But in the end, she had come out on the other side. Her victory wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a statement. A declaration that justice, though it may be slow and painful, was not impossible. Now, as she looked forward, Maya knew her fight had made a difference. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about getting through each day or finding the strength to keep going. It was about making sure that what had happened to her would never happen to anyone else. She had opened a door for others to walk through, a door that had once been locked tight by fear, corruption, and silence. Maya's voice, once quiet and unsure, had grown louder with each step she took on her path to healing. And as she held her child close, feeling their soft breath against her chest, she knew that her victory, her survival, had created ripples that would reach far beyond the walls of that courtroom. She had made a difference, for herself, for her baby, and for countless others who would follow in her footsteps. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Maya was ready. She had learned that justice is more than just a verdict, it's a journey. And she was just getting started. That if this story moved you, if it made you think about the world we live in, hit subscribe. Together, we can expose the truth, share these powerful stories, and push for a better tomorrow.